good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Today, Wednesday, the 18th of December, is International Migrants Day in Southeast Asia. There are about 11.6 million people who are migrant workers, 5.2 million of whom are women. Now, many countries, including ours, rely on migrant workers to fill critical labour shortages. But what do you think people think of migrant workers? Now, the International Labour Organization has released a report titled Public Attitudes Towards Migrant Workers in Japan, Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand, which attempts to answer this question. So let's take a look at two of the most interesting findings. Number one, 47% of respondents in Malaysia believe that migrant workers are a drain on the economy, and 83% believe that migration and crime are linked. What do you make of this, Sharaad?
Well, I think it's an old story of misunderstanding about how the economy works. And so people seem to think that, and you hear it all the time, and it's sometimes reflected in some of the popular tabloids, that migrants are here and they're somehow taking away money. And so the remittances issue is often a big one, right? People are sending money home. This could have been money that was held here.
Kept in the economy.
But it only kind of works if you don't understand how value is created in an economy, right? How do we get the wealth that we do? I mean, how are industries driven, and how crucial are migrant workers, in fact, to the structure of our economy? And why has it come to the point that we have millions of people working for us?
Well, when I looked at this report, Sharaad, those two findings particularly struck me the most, because I find these attitudes really suggest a fundamental view that migrant workers should be treated differently. It normalizes xenophobia. It normalizes discrimination. And I think this is a real problem. These ideas not only devalue the work that migrant workers do, which, as you pointed out, but also it exacerbates the bad living conditions that migrant workers are already facing.
Yeah. So, but there's also a question of fact, right? So let's just look at the question of the link between migrants and crime. And I think, many years ago, and this was addressed in Parliament, were or are migrant workers or foreigners overrepresented in the crime statistics? And those years, many years ago, 15 years ago or so, it was not. So migrants are not overrepresented. So yes, there are criminal elements in the migrant population, and for some people that's just one too many.
Do you think?
But they're not overrepresented.
Do you think the media has a role to play in this, in hyper-sensationalizing news or crime related to foreign workers, migrant workers?
That's absolutely. There's a tendency to kind of mention the identity of a criminal, their national origins, perhaps not as important to the story as perhaps actually what they did. But it's part of the kind of populist thing, right? It's easy to blame other people for anything. So if you're going through hardship, if you're not getting a good wage, if you feel that you're getting a raw deal from the employer, it's easy to blame somebody else. The reality is, if you take foreign workers out of the equation in Malaysia, what would happen to our economy? If we just look around, how dependent are we?
Sure.
And would those jobs return to Malaysians? Would Malaysians get higher wages if foreigners would? Perhaps, and there's this issue around how foreigners are part of the equation for wage suppression, right? So all these need to be worked out.
On that point, because it is International Migrants Day, I was thinking about some of the questions when it comes to migrant workers. And here are a couple of things that we should consider tonight. These questions are, that we should be considering the answers to how we view these questions. Should migrant workers have equal wages with nationals doing the same jobs?
Well, okay, so that would be, and this
exactly
would be
what you pointed out, with wage suppression.
If in fact foreign workers did have those protections, it would be a reason to keep wages up, right? Because the fact that foreigners get lower wages might in fact drive wages down for Malaysians as well. There are complexities, and the issue is the level of, I think, economic literacy. Our understanding of the economy, I think, plays a huge role in the way people think about migrant workers.
The other thing I want us to consider tonight is, should migrant workers have access to free public services? And the reason I thought about this was because the smart Selangor buses will no longer be available for free for foreigners.
Well, so there again, it's a
beginning 2020.
It's how we imagine the city, right? So in the city, if we want our cities to work better, then surely everybody who works in it, operates it, ought to have efficient means of transport.
Sure.
If we are saying now, but because they're non-citizens, we want to deny them that, then we're going to create a backlog, and we're going to create problems for ourselves because we want to, deny non-citizens a right to access to transport. Cities don't work on the basis of, citizenship. They work on the basis of who lives there.
But it's not just cities, so to interrupt you, Sharaad, it's not just cities, right? It's also, and it's not just transport, but it's also access to healthcare, which is something we're going to come back to when we discuss the recent polio case in Sabah. But for now, I'd like to focus on Lembah Pantai MP Fahmi Fazil has presented a report card on his first-year achievements. Now, he's claiming he's the first MP to do so. In this report card, he outlined 10 achievements he's made since winning the seat in May last year. What do you think, Sharaad, about this practice of elected representatives issuing their report card?
Well, okay, so the report card metaphor is a curious one because, often the student doesn't get the report card. The report is given by the teacher to assess the MP. So who would be the teacher in this story? I think it would be the Prime Minister? Potentially the Prime Minister, the party, whatever it is. But what I do
or
think...
the voters, perhaps.
I think it's actually a very successful way of communicating the idea of performance, right? So we think of report cards and performance, and MPs want to shout out their achievements. But the issue is they're doing it on their own behalf. So the question, again, is their own assessment or their assessment of themselves an honest one or an accurate one or an adequate one?
Right. I'm a bit split with this. Now, I absolutely agree with you. I think, it's a good way to communicate what they've achieved so far, and I think it helps to go in solving Pakatan Harapan's communication problem. The lack of communication they've had this year, it's been atrocious. So perhaps this is one way to go about, communicating all their achievements. However, I worry whether this could lead to, encourage kind of populist, easy, low-hanging fruit measures what politicians do. Because what's really important is the structural reform, the institutional reform, which may not be as sexy on an infographic.
Or actually, lend itself to being able to be communicated, right, on an infographic.
Exactly.
So one of the things that Fahmi Fazil points out to is 100 micro libraries. I really love the idea. I don't know what it is. I guess it's a small library.
Is it a bookshelf?
It could be a bookshelf somewhere.
It's more than that.
And that's what we need to find out. And that's where the media comes in, because the media needs to go down to the ground and look at these things and say, well, okay, maybe 100. How effective are they? What are they creating? Good things, bad things, unintended consequences from these initiatives, and that's how we get somewhere closer to an adequate assessment of somebody's performance.
Do you want to see more report cards come out from other politicians?
I think so. I think, why not? Because it ups the ante on all the politicians across the board. Let them actually focus on convincing us they're actually performing, and they're doing we're getting bang for our buck, because we are paying them, aren't we?
All right. We'll come back after this and take a closer look at that re-emergence of polio in Sabah. Make sure you stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you tonight. Now, Malaysians were left reeling after the Ministry of Health confirmed last week that the first case of polio in the country had emerged, and this after being declared polio-free 27 years ago. The news was particularly shocking because vaccinations, thought to eliminate 99% of the risk of contracting polio, is widely available at all Malaysian government hospitals. So what has happened? Now, to discuss this further, we have joining us in the studio Dr. Admiral Anza, Megat Hashim, Exco of Strategic Planning for Vaccination Campaign of Medical Mythbusters Malaysia, which is a registered NGO. Welcome, Dr. Admiral, to the show. Now, how have you made sense of what has happened?
Right. First of all, I think it's quite a sad news that we can see that our country has actually gone backwards in terms of the health issues. Because, like you said just now, polio is something that has been eradicated. We are certified a polio-free country since the year 2000. And our last polio case is somewhere in 1992. And for the past 27 years, we have been freed of polio. But recently, we have another polio case in Tuaran, Sabah, which is something that is quite shocking and also saddening.
Okay, so when you looked at the headlines, what were your theories? I mean, do you have a way of explaining to yourself what could have happened?
Okay, I would put the blame on vaccine hesitancy and vaccine refusal all the way. And I would say that this is all because of the anti-vaxxers, okay? Partly, we need to understand that the viruses, particularly polioviruses, does not know of any borders. And similarly to the movement of anti-vaccine, it does not only happen in Malaysia, it also comes from all sorts of other countries as well, as the US, in Philippines as well. So what happened is actually the vaccine refusals has increased, not only in Malaysia, but also in the Philippines. And we also have seen that there are also outbreaks of polio in Philippines since September 2019. So what we are seeing in our neighboring country, we have already seen in Malaysia.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the vaccine hesitancy with Dr. Amy Wroe in just a minute. But we have joining us on Skype YB Jennifer Lasimbang, Assistant Minister of Education and Innovation for Sabah. Now, she previously worked with UNICEF and had recently highlighted that Sabah's current polio problem could have been averted if the Federal Health Ministry had heeded UNICEF's warnings 5 years ago. Thank you so much for joining us, YB Jen. Now, you worked with UNICEF between 2014 and 2017. So why don't you tell us the backstory to these polio warnings?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Back in 2014, 2017, I was working as a consultant to UNICEF Malaysia. And my main work is looking at issues that children face, particularly in Sabah and Sarawak. But most of my work actually was in Sabah, and we were actually very worried about a particular population, a group of children, i.e., the undocumented children in Sabah. And so, knowing that children without documents, the progression is they wouldn't have an identity, they wouldn't have had the access to healthcare and education. And one of them is the situation or the possibility of them being not vaccinated or not immunized.
What was the follow-up then? I mean, if you had UNICEF had issued a warning to the Federal Ministry, what did you get in response?
What we were trying to do was to work with the Philippines embassy to get the vaccines. We know that the MOH does give vaccination to migrant workers and also undocumented persons with a fee. And knowing that they wouldn't be able to afford that vaccine, UNICEF, I'm speaking as then a consultant, we tried to work with MOH to administer vaccines that would be provided by the Philippines embassy to assist us in the issue.
Do you think, YB Jen, that it's actually short-sighted for the Malaysian government to rely on other agencies or actors to, bear the cost of the immunization when in fact it has a direct bearing on the health of local populations? I mean, why not just take on that, that financial burden for the good of Malaysians?
Well, it happened 5 years ago or more, and because of that warning, we were trying to work out something with the Ministry of Health, particularly with the Department of Health in Sabah, but unfortunately it didn't happen. So now I know that the Malaysian government is working with UNICEF Malaysia and WHO to remedy this situation at this point.
So, YB Jen, you know, there are, according to the Home Ministry statistics, there are some 500,000 undocumented persons in Sabah. 95% of that is children, and they've not been immunized. So the response from the federal government is saying they're now going to immunize all these children. But is that going to be enough? Because polio is perhaps the one that came to the forefront in this time around. What about the other, what is, you know, under the surface? Could polio be the first of many to emerge?
I fear that is the case, because it could have been averted with just a simple immunization practice to immunize all population, regardless of their nationality, that is staying in Sabah, in Malaysia. And I think it's time for us to go and find the solution. We know the situation, and I fear that if we don't do it now, I know that UNICEF, WHO, and MOH is working emergency, in districts that's highly exposed to diseases and under-immunized in certain areas. And we really have to look at this problem. We really look for the solution. We have to do all that we can at this point.
YB Jen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Appreciate your time on this. We come back now to the studio with Dr Amy Wroe from the Medical Mythbusters Malaysia. What did you make of the comments that YB Jen just made?
All right, okay, I frankly agree with what she has said. It's very important that our Ministry of Health to work with other agencies, including our own other ministries and also the agencies globally, to help us in tackling these issues. What has happened 5 years ago, we must let it go, okay? We must look what will happen next, okay? And I believe that the Ministry of Health is doing its best in remedying the issue.
Right, so one of the things that you had mentioned is your sense that anti-vaxxers or this decision not to or to refuse vaccination for children is part of the problem. Right. But what about just the technology? Is the technology available for health officials to monitor those borders? Huge borders between Sabah and the Philippines, and Sabah is an integral part of the Sulu world. On other sides, we have other borders with Thailand and so on and so forth. Do we have the wherewithal? Is there enough money to monitor those borders?
Of course, we are working in a very limited resource, right? And if we were to see the situation, if it's happening in Peninsular Malaysia, it will be totally different. But in Sabah and Sarawak as well, you know, the access towards the place where these people live is even access to them is quite difficult. So just to monitor them, just to make sure all of them are getting vaccinated, and also it's also quite difficult because most of them are not even registered. We don't even have a registry for them. So to ensure that we have covered the immunization for all of them is very, very difficult actually.
All right, we're going to go to a quick break, but after this we're going to bust some medical myths and information on social media. We'll be right back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's come back to our conversation with Dr Admiral Anza from Medical Mythbusters Malaysia. Now, I'd like to discuss busting some medical myths and misinformation on social media. One of the conversation threads that have emerged from the Sabah polio case was on anti-vaxxers, or as you say, vaccine hesitancy and refusal. Now, talk to me a little bit, Dr Admiral, about how you deal with anti-vaxxers, anti-vaxxer groups on social media.
Okay, when we talk about anti-vaccine, the proper term for it is actually vaccine hesitancy and refusal. That's what WHO called them. And in January this year, WHO has deemed them as one of the threats, one of the 10 threats to the global health in the whole world, actually.
Wow.
So when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, it's divided into three main classes. The first one is just the fancier, the vaccine hesitant. The second one probably just a little bit adamant about their ideas, the vaccine refusers. But the most dangerous one is the anti-vaccine or the vocal vaccine deniers, which these are the people who spread misinformation. In Malaysia, mainly they are using the social medias, in particularly Facebook, not so often Twitter or Instagram, but mostly in Facebook. What they are doing is actually they are skewing the facts. They are telling lies about vaccine, and they're telling that the vaccine is not necessary and it's probably not safe.
I want to ask you this because we recently had a case of outbreak of measles in Samoa, and I think the government there arrested a campaigner, anti-vaxxer campaigner, and it raises the question of whether the law should be used to stop anti-vaxxers, that we actually criminalize it. I mean, what would your position be on that?
It would be of my personal opinion. I think what happened in Samoa is a good example of what we should be doing here. At least probably not to put them as a criminal, but at least to have them, to stop them actually from giving lies in social media. At least to get rid of the platforms for them. So probably that will be really beneficial for us.
You know, in your role in trying to myth bust, all this that medical misinformation on social media, I'm just wondering, is there, can you change people's minds on social media? Sometimes they're set in their ways. There's just no changing someone's mind.
Right, okay.
Is that the case with anti-vaxxers?
That's why you remember when I told there are three classes of them. Of course, there is no changing for those vocal vaccine deniers, but those who are fanciers or probably the vaccine refuser, we can change them with a proper information. The problem is our challenges that we faces is because we are also fighting with the vocal vaccine deniers who's trying to change the fanciers towards
like
their side. It's just
two
fighting.
voices.
Yes.
Yes, the thing is, the person who denies or is hesitant might actually, if they were only affecting themselves, it would probably be okay. But they're actually affecting not only the community, but their children. And I wonder if the rights of children to immunization is something, or an entry point to stop this practice by parents to deny their children the right to good health.
Yes, okay. Because in Malaysia, our community is mostly a paternal community, which we rely solely on the parents to make decisions for their children. However, vaccination is not the choice of the parents, but it's the rights of the children. Same like how the children needs education for their lives, same things goes with vaccination. They need it and it's their right.
You know, I know anti-vaxxers have done a lot of damage on social media in terms of skewing information or creating false information. But I read a report not too long ago that said one of the reasons why the immunization cycle is often not complete is not because of vaccine hesitancy and refusal, but rather parents lack the time to bring their children for vaccination. How do you deal with that?
Okay, because you need to understand the factors that makes people do not take vaccination is not only limited to the fall in the confidence to vaccination, but also it falls to other four factors. One of them is actually the constraint, the lack of time to go to the nearby clinic kesihatan to get vaccinated, the lack of means, like the poor Sabahan people, who is the stateless people, also they have their constraint in getting them. So these people might not be affected by the anti-vaccine ideology, but they are mostly about the economics and also logistics issue.
What about the question of, on the side of the anti-vaxxers, not just the deniers, but the people hesitant, the question of trust? Can you help us understand that sometimes actually people are responding to real-life situations? They're not deluded. Something has happened to them that makes them not trust the authorities.
Right.
Hasn't that happened? I mean, haven't the authorities sometimes bungled it?
Of course, the authorities have a very tough time dealing with this because conspiracies existed far long time ago. So it's actually up to the people, to people like us who give them advocacies, who give them to try to explain to them that what the government is doing is actually for their best. There is no government in the world that's want harm for their own people.
Right, but there have been mistakes that have been made by governments when it comes to vaccinations and such. Would that be true?
I wouldn't say it's a mistake actually, but of course the current polio virus is not a wild polio virus. It's actually a CVDPV. It's a circulating vaccine-derived polio virus. It does not derive from the vaccine that we are giving currently. It actually derived from the old OPV or the weakened oral polio vaccine. Okay, and this happened not only because we are giving the polio vaccine as a weakened state, but it happens when there are lack of coverage. That probably because of the anti-vaccine movement and also because of the constraint. Not enough coverage caused the virus to be mutated and also caused them to do harm right now.
So when you say coverage, is that not enough of the population has the vaccination?
Vaccination,
Correct.
yes.
Yeah. Okay, wow. Thank you so much for sharing those insights with us, Dr. Admiral. Appreciate your time joining us here in the studio. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Curtin. We will be back with you same time tomorrow. Thank you for watching and good night.